Our first activity is called the source sort game. For this game, you will be given 10 sources. Some of those sources are primary sources and some of them are secondary sources. It's your job to decide which is a primary source and which is a secondary source. Now, each of these sources has two sides. On one side, you'll see an image of the source, and on the other, you'll find some information about that source. On some of the sources, you'll see an image, and on the back, it'll have what we call an excerpt. An excerpt is just a small amount of text from that source. So you won't have to read the whole source, but maybe just a paragraph or a sentence or two. Now, you'll be racing against the clock. You have 10 minutes to look at all 10 sources and put them into two piles, one pile for primary and one pile for secondary. Teachers, pause the video here and put 10 minutes on the clock and give the students a chance to sort the primary sources. Okay, let's see how well you did sorting the primary and secondary sources. I'll use the numbers on the top left corner of the sources to go through in order. So our first source was a primary source. And this is, of course, the Declaration of Independence from July 4th, 1776. Our second source was a secondary source. This is a textbook called the Georgia Studies book, Our State and Nation. And on the back, there was an excerpt about the French and Indian War and how the French and Indian War caused tensions that led to the American Revolution. So, source number 2, secondary source. Source number 3 was an article from the New Georgia Encyclopedia, which is an online resource, and it was also a secondary source. On the back, you read a quick excerpt that talked about how Georgia did not send representatives to the First Continental Congress. In fact, Georgia was a little bit slower than the other colonies to catch the Revolutionary War fever. Many of Georgia's citizens wanted to remain loyal to the crown, especially at first. Source number 4 is an artifact from the Georgia Historical Society collection. It's a drum from the Revolutionary War. And this drum is in fact a primary source because it comes from the time period we're studying. Source number 5 is a map that is housed at the Library of Congress, another archive like the Georgia Historical Society. And this map was published in 1763. So it gives us an interesting view of what the colonies looked like before the American Revolution. You can see a lot of differences between the way Georgia looks now and the way it did then. One of the things you'll notice is the large Native American presence in Georgia at this time. And that was really important for the colonists because without Britain's help in creating treaties with the Native Americans, they might have felt unsafe. And so that's another reason why some Georgians didn't want to break apart from the British. So that was item number 5, and it was a primary source. Item number 6 is an article from the Georgia Historical Quarterly. And on the back, you read a short excerpt about the Battle of Briar Creek. This was a battle that happened in Georgia during the American Revolutionary War. Now, the Georgia Historical Quarterly is considered a scholarly journal. It's published 4 times a year. And this scholarly journal and the articles in it are secondary sources. These are written by scholars who study a topic, study the primary sources, write the article, send it in, and get it published in the journal. So that's item number 6, and it was a secondary source. Item number 7 is a book called Georgia and the American Revolution. And on the back, you read a quick excerpt about another battle during the American Revolution in Georgia called the Battle of Kettle Creek. The Battle of Kettle Creek was really interesting because the forces were largely Georgian patriots and loyalists on the other side. Now, loyalists were those who decided they didn't want to break apart from Great Britain. And so some people even call this battle like a civil war because it was fought between the citizens of the colonies and not British soldiers largely. So this book is a secondary source. Again, it was written after the time period you're studying by historians learning about the topic. So again, that's source number 7, and it's secondary. Source number 8 is the United States Constitution. And this source has multiple pages because it's a bit of a longer document than our other sources. And on the back, there were excerpts from each page. And on the final page, we made sure to point out who were the signers from Georgia: William Few and Abraham Baldwin. Now, this source, the United States Constitution, is a primary source. So item number 8, the Constitution, is a primary source. Item number 9 is called Washington's General, Nathaniel Greene and the Triumph of the American Revolution. And on the back, you read a short excerpt that explains that Nathaniel Greene was put in charge of the Southern Command. And this, of course, is a secondary source. So number 9 is a secondary source. Our last source, source number 10, is a letter written by a woman who lived in Savannah, and her name was Abigail Minus. She wrote this letter in 1780. She was explaining that she had given provisions and money to the American forces, and she had not been reimbursed for that yet. And she was trying to get a receipt and some type of proof so she could be reimbursed for all the provisions she gave. So this last letter, written in 1780, is a primary source because it was written by someone who was an eyewitness to that history. So number 10 was a primary source. I hope you now understand the difference between primary and secondary sources and have a little bit better idea about the kinds of resources we keep at archives like the Georgia Historical Society.